Continuing on with Chapter 19, we're looking at the lead up to the Civil War between 1854 and 1861. Now, when last we saw John Brown, he was participating in Bleeding Kansas. Remember, he is a militant abolitionist, and he felt that it was his God's mission in order to stop slavery in the United States. So after his work in Kansas, he moved to Virginia in October of 1859. And he wanted to create an attack on the federal arsenal located at Harper's Ferry. His hope was that by attacking this federal arsenal, they could capture guns and ammunition and whatnot, and spur a slave revolt in the surrounding area to help create a free black state. That was his end goal. During John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, 7 innocent people were killed and injured. And injured 10. There was no slave revolt. Nobody really knew about it. It wasn't heavily advertised, I guess would be a way to say it, until finally the U.S. Marines were called in, led by Robert E. Lee, and John Brown and his followers were captured and put on trial for treason and murder. Eventually, John Brown was convicted and hung for his crime of treason. Now, at the trial, it came up whether or not John Brown was insane, and some evidence had been presented during the trial that his family had been insane, that there was a long line of insanity. Now, many people would also argue that this was just an attempt to save his life, but it didn't matter, because in the end he was hanged for his crime, and with his execution he was essentially martyred to many of those northern abolitionists, that he had died for the cause. Many people, such as Emerson, compared him to Jesus by what he had done. This only once again angered the South even more, and even though not all Northerners were as extreme as John Brown, the perception was that everyone up north were Brown-loving Republicans, all looking to get rid of slavery. This happens right on the eve of the election of 1860, the presidential election of 1860. The Democratic Party has been struggling for a while in terms of trying to maintain a cohesive national party. They really are the last national party around, because the Whigs have pretty much disseminated by this time. So the Democrats met at their nominating convention in Charleston, South Carolina, to nominate a candidate. Stephen Douglas was obviously the northern favorite. However, because of his involvement, or because he was against that Lecompton Constitution, because of the Freeport Doctrine he'd given just 2 years before, Southerners were completely against Stephen Douglas, and they walked out of the convention. Without these delegates, there were not enough votes in order to name Stephen Douglas the candidate, and so the Democratic nominating convention had to disband for the time being. They tried again. They met at Baltimore, Maryland, to once again try to nominate a candidate. This time the Northern Democrats were prepared and had solidified enough votes. Even after the Southern delegates left, the Northern Democrats were able to nominate Stephen Douglas. His platform for the 1860 election is once again unpopular sovereignty, and he was against trying to obstruct the fugitive slave law. He was in favor, obviously, of protecting it. This was kind of the bone that was being thrown to the Southern Democrats to try to lure them back to the party. However, the Southern Democrats weren't buying it. They had their own nominating convention in order to nominate John C. Breckinridge from Kentucky. His platform, now remember, these are both Democrats, but they are from 2 different sides of the United States. John Breckinridge's platform as a Southern Democrat was on extending slavery into the territories and annexing Cuba, obviously once again to expand slavery down south. And finally, a third group was formed out of the Democratic Party, a group of moderates who were very much worried for the Union since the Democratic Party was splitting apart. They called themselves the Constitutional Union Party. Now, once again, these had been Democrats. And they nominated a more moderate candidate of John Bell from Tennessee. He was more focused on keeping things the way they were. Don't rock the boat. Maintain the status quo. So here we see in the 1860 election what had previously been a national political party has now been split into three different segments. Here you see the political or the electoral vote breakdown in terms of who voted for whom. Breckinridge obviously in the south, Bell in the middle parts, and Lincoln and some Douglas votes up north. Now, the Republicans is brand new political party, and it absolutely is a sectional party. Their focus is on stopping the expansion of slavery into the West. Obviously, this is not going to be a Southern political party at this time. They met in Chicago to nominate a candidate for their presidential candidate. Seward, who had been the best-known Republican to date, was deemed to be too divisive and too radical. Too many people knew all of his errors and all of his issues and why he was so much against the expansion of slavery. Abraham Lincoln, who had made a name for himself during the Lincoln-Douglas debates and during the last senatorial campaign in 1858, was eventually nominated by the Republican Party, partly because nobody really knew anything about him. Very little was known, therefore he didn't have that many enemies. Their platform was geared completely towards northern groups. They had no chance of securing any southern votes. So they're focusing on no slavery in the territories, to have a high tariff to lure in those northern industrialists, to provide equal rights for immigrants, once again focusing on those northern cities, to build a railroad through the Pacific Northwest, to increase internal improvements for the Westerners, and to provide more homesteads out west for farmers living in the western states. The South declared when Lincoln was nominated that if Lincoln should win this election, it would mean immediate secession. That even though Lincoln in 1860 was not advocating an end to slavery everywhere, he was only advocating for free soil, it didn't matter. The South was fed up. They were done with this. If Lincoln won, it would mean secession, leaving the Union. But since the Democratic Party was split three different ways, this is what opened the door to allow a Northern Republican Party to squeak on through in a national election, because people who would have traditionally voted Democrat now had three different options. And so Lincoln won this election with 180 electoral votes, evenly split right down the middle. So after the election of Lincoln, remember the election occurs in November, by December of 1860, the state of South Carolina held special conventions across the state in which they unanimously voted to secede from the Union. So South Carolina was the first to go. And within 6 weeks after South Carolina seceded, six more states followed suit: Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. There would still be 4 more to go later on that would include Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. During this time, they formed the Confederate States of America, or the CSA, and they named Jefferson Davis, former Secretary of War, as their president. The Confederate States of America, this is focusing on a loose affiliation of the states. They based their ability to secede on that compact theory that we've talked about before with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions way back in the days of Jefferson and Madison, that if we voluntarily entered this union, we should voluntarily be able to leave. So the CSA, much like every confederacy, is going to be a loose affiliation of these states, with Jefferson Davis named as the president. Now, during this entire time that these states were seceding from the Union, Abraham Lincoln is stuck during this lame duck period. He can do nothing to stop as these states secede from the Union, because he's still technically not the president of the United States. James Buchanan, who, even though he wasn't in favor of secession, he was surrounded by Southern advisors. And while he didn't believe in secession, he also didn't believe that he had the power to stop them from going. This is completely different compared to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln felt that secession was unconstitutional, yet he could do nothing to stop it. Here you see where some of the opposition was to secession, namely in that mountain white region of the Appalachian Mountains going down. Here is Jefferson Davis. Now, the question still is compromise possible? Can we still come together? Can we turn this ship around right now? And so James Henry Crittenden from Kentucky comes up with a last-minute proposed compromise to try to lure the South back in. Here was his proposed compromise: that all territories north of the 3630 line would not allow slavery. South of the 3630 line would allow for federal protection of slavery, including any and all future territories. And then finally, when statehood came, whether it be north of that 3630 line or south of that 3630 line, all territories would be given the option of whether or not to vote for slavery or against slavery. The idea was that obviously if slavery had not been allowed north of the 3630 line during the territorial stage, there weren't going to be any pro-slavery advocates there to vote yes. But south of the 3630 line, they could vote yes. Now, Abraham Lincoln, even though he is still just the president-elect, really tried to quash this compromise. First and foremost, he had campaigned on the issue of no expansion of slavery into the territories. The Crittenden Amendment would have allowed for a continued expansion of slaves. Also, he opposed it because it would have only added more fuel to the fire of achieving more territories, going after Cuba, Nicaragua, any of the other Latin American countries. So Lincoln says, no, we're not going to allow this Crittenden Compromise because it is opening a floodgate that I don't want to go down. And so the Crittenden Amendment was never passed, and so it is time for civil war. Now, when looking at the reasons for secession, 11 states ultimately decided to leave the Union. Several reasons. We always talk about the issue of slavery, and obviously that is a major part of it, but there's a lot more to this as well. The North has always been the more populous between the two areas, and we've talked about that since the founding of these places as colonies, that the South was more focused on a plantation-style economy, so therefore they couldn't account for as many people versus the more populous North where cities were being formed. And so with more population also comes more political and economic power for the North. There was a real fear of the growing power of the Republican Party among Southerners. This was a sectional party, and the fear among many Southerners was who was going to protect the rights of us slaveholders down the South. There was really this feeling that free soilers and abolitionists had run their mouth far too long, and it's time to strike a blow back against this sentiment. And many Southerners did truly believe that secession would be peaceful, that even if the North didn't want them to go, they never saw a huge civil war occurring like they thought. They thought it would be a peaceful departure, and that we would continue to have economic ties between the North and the South. So even if we are two separate countries, we can still work together to create an economic tie, you know, the cotton from the South being transported up north into the textile industries. And to many Southerners, secession truly was an opportunity for them to express their views on government, that they should have a right to self-determination. Self-determination is the right of the people to choose their own government. They wanted to create a government that was based on their culture, their ideas, their values. And many Southerners linked this to the Revolution. To them, this was a second revolution. They'd voluntarily entered the Union, and now they were leaving. So once again, linking it back to that compact theory. And so with that, 11 states seceded from the Union, and the next chapter is going to focus on the coming Civil War.